the protocol algorithm, red flags, questions to ask, barriers to screening, and resources. Okay, part one, background information. The presenters of the webinar are Chris Setz-Kelly. He's a staff attorney for Nationalities Service Center. Ms. Nora Kramer, RN, MSc, NRN, and Trauma, Injury, Prevention, and Education Department at Jefferson University Hospital. And myself, I am Camille Whitsett. I'm a clinical counselor, trauma therapist, and I specialize in sexual assault, abuse, and rape, and I work at Comar. Now, it's just a basic information on our disclosure that this webinar was created on a pro bono basis and that the presenters and persons putting the webinar together have volunteered their time and resources. Now, the goals of the webinar are to understand the elements of human trafficking, to learn red flags and questions to ask to identify potential human trafficking victims in a healthcare setting, and to introduce recommended protocol steps to assist potential human trafficking victims using frontline healthcare staff and human trafficking point persons. Now, the learning objectives are defining point persons, defining frontline staff, describing the points of entry, human trafficking to define that, to recognize red flags of human trafficking, to learn protocol steps to assist potential human trafficking victims, importance of patient confidentiality, and to understand the barriers to identifying. Now, first, let's go into what a human trafficking point person is. The healthcare staff who are ultimately responsible to guide the potential victim through the human trafficking protocol. This is what the point person does. It can be a frontline staff person or a healthcare provider. And we'll go a little bit further into what the frontline staff and healthcare providers are. The point person is the most critical staff for the recommended protocol to be successful. And they may be given other titles to perform this specific duty. So a point person at one hospital or one healthcare center may be given a different title than a point person at another healthcare center. However, the responsibilities are exactly the same. Now, the point person is thoroughly trained in all aspects of trafficking. The reason why they're thoroughly trained is that they need to make educated decisions about the movement of the potentially trafficked person. This assures that the potentially trafficked person does not get lost as they are moving through the healthcare system and receiving referrals to appropriate law enforcement if necessary, and also receiving additional resources as a survivor. The point person can also provide referrals so that the potential trafficked person, someone can follow up to make sure that they are okay. The point person it can be expanded into a team if necessary, depending on the size of the facility. Again, the point person is there to make sure that that potentially trafficked person does not get lost through the system. And that can happen so easily in hospitals and in clinics and various different types of healthcare settings. The point person will also get in contact with the national or local hotlines for that potential trafficked person. And it's basically up to the point person. So once that point person receives that potentially trafficked person, that point person will help guide that potentially trafficked person to receive all the services that are deemed necessary for them. Now, the frontline staff. The frontline staff are the first personnel who meet a patient at the point of entry into the healthcare system. Now, as you can see from this picture, the frontline staff can be clerks, nurses, nutritionalists, caseworkers, a CAT scan tech, physicians, security personnel, volunteers, triage, or any other staff person who will have the first contact with the potentially trafficked person. Now, healthcare providers are people who help in identifying, preventing, or treating illnesses or disabilities. Physicians, clinical psychiatrists, psychologists, nurse practitioners, midwives, and clinical social workers. These persons are authorized to practice by state and perform within the scope of their practice. Now, again, the point person can be either a healthcare provider or a frontline person. Now, for the point of entry, let's talk about that a little bit. The point of entry is any healthcare setting where an injured or sick person goes to receive health and/or urgent care. The hospital emergency room, a freestanding clinic, a community health clinic or center, an urgent care center, or any municipal, state, or federal clinics. A few of us here that are doing the presentation work in these types of settings. And at the point of entry, the frontline person is often at the point of entry, as well as a healthcare provider. So it's extremely important to know what to look for so that you can find someone who is a potential trafficked person so that they can get to the point person. So the point of entry is an extremely important area as well, because that's when this potentially trafficked person is introduced into the system, and it gives an opportunity for the frontline person and or the healthcare providers to be aware of the red flags, which you will be reintroduced to later on in the presentation, to know what to look for to identify someone who is a potential trafficked person.
My name is Chris Setz-Kelly. I'm a staff attorney with Nationalities Service Center. So by this point, you're probably wondering, what is human trafficking? Now, human trafficking is a crime defined under both federal and state law, and it sort of stems from the tradition of outlawing forced labor and involuntary servitude in this country. But human trafficking laws are meant to cover sort of the increased use of more nuanced ways of controlling and exploiting people for the purposes of either commercial sex or involuntary servitude. So, the first federal law to address trafficking was the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. And here you can see both the definitions of sex and labor trafficking under that law. You might look them over and see that they're kind of convoluted. So advocates, as well as law enforcement, have found it useful to use this model that's right up here on the screen for you, called the AMP model, that kind of breaks down the definition of both sex and labor trafficking into an act, a means, and a purpose. So on the left side of the screen, you see the various acts that can kind of constitute the act of trafficking, whether it's the recruiting, transporting, providing, harboring, obtaining, and then enticing, maintaining, patronizing, soliciting, or advertising. Everything on the screen from enticing down to advertising was recently added to the Trafficking Victim Protection Act by the Justice for Trafficking Victims Act of 2015, which just sort of shows that protection for victims is increasing, and there's a lot more advocacy efforts still being undertaken, to protect victims and prosecute traffickers. So once you see that there's a sort of a specific act, it's kind of an actus reus, as we would call it as lawyers under the law, we're looking at a means. How is that trafficker inducing that person into the commercial sex or forced labor act that makes out the trafficking? So that can be done through force, fraud, or coercion. Some state laws even prescribe additional ways in which this means can be carried out. And then finally, are these acts being carried out for the purposes of either commercial sex or forced labor? And one caveat is that for cases involving minors who are engaged in commercial sex, there's no need to show that that minor was forced or defrauded or coerced into being put in that place. It's just presumed under the law that that minor is being exploited in a way that we would deem trafficking. I mentioned that not only is trafficking divided under federal law, but here in Pennsylvania since 2014, we've had a law in the books called Act 105, which is a very comprehensive law that does a number of things. The three kind of primary areas that it addresses are the prosecution of human trafficking, the prevention of human trafficking in the future, and the protection of victims and survivors. And here you can kind of see some of the ways in which it carries out those objectives. By expanding the legal definition of trafficking in the state, it gives prosecutors better tools to hold traffickers and purchasers of services provided by trafficking victims accountable. So it expands on the ways in which, for example, someone can be induced into a trafficking act. So beyond force, fraud, or coercion, there are things in the law such as facilitating a victim's access to a controlled substance or debt coercion, which recognizes that trafficking now can take many forms that maybe weren't recognized even under the federal law. So in some ways, the Pennsylvania law is stronger than the federal law. It also calls for a state plan to coordinate anti-trafficking initiatives and to educate the community and stakeholders about human trafficking in order to prevent trafficking from happening. And finally, it provides new and enhanced protections for victims of trafficking. Some of the examples of this are there's a private right of action that allows trafficking victims to actually sue their trafficker in state court for money damages. And it also allows victims who are being charged with crimes often related to prostitution to assert as an affirmative defense at their criminal trial that these crimes were carried out while they were a victim of trafficking, while they were being exploited, so that they can avoid receiving those criminal convictions that can be barriers to employment and other things, as they seek to get out of the life that they were trapped in. Vulnerability factors. There are a number of different factors that we see across cases, and some of them are listed on the screen. Lack of legal status, lack of economic opportunities. I would say those are specifically very common in the labor trafficking cases, particularly for people who are from countries other than the United States. They come to the U.S. and because they lack legal documentation, they're often foreclosed from obtaining more traditional jobs. So they're looking for these employment opportunities that are kind of on the fringes of society that make them open to, accepting jobs for well under minimum wage or from employers who are verbally and physically abusive of them. Lack of social, family support, homelessness, runaway youth in foster care systems, LGBTQ, and history of abuse. I would say those last few factors you see oftentimes in the sex trafficking cases, particularly with minors. And that's not to say that all LGBTQ people are particularly vulnerable to trafficking, but it's just recognizing that in parts of our society there's still a lot of work to do in terms of preventing discrimination that leads to those communities being marginalized, which is something that a trafficker will use. Oftentimes they're looking to pick off those people who don't have that support system in their life. Some of the top industries that we see trafficking in, domestic work. In terms of domestic work, we're often talking about those who are serving as nannies or au pairs, working in another person's home. A lot of times the traffickers taking advantage of that person's either lack of legal status here in the country or perhaps their age. And those cases can be highly coercive because we see traffickers entrust the care of their small children to a nanny or an au pair. So even if that person recognizes that they're being mistreated by the trafficker, they feel this obligation to continue caring for the child, who they, by that time, would have a close bond with. Restaurant, peddling rings, agriculture, construction, pimp-controlled prostitution, getting into the sex trafficking cases, commercial front brothels, escort services, pornography, residential brothels. Power and control tactics of human traffickers. For those who have done domestic violence work, you've probably seen similar wheels, kind of identifying the ways in which an abuser can exert control over their victim. There are some common dynamics that are also present in trafficking scenarios. So some of the ones we would highlight would be coercion and threats. In the labor trafficking cases, we often see our clients' identification and legal documents taken from them, so that in essence they're robbed of their ability to show that they're in this country lawfully. That can have a highly coercive effect on the victim. Even in the sex trafficking cases, I've heard that particularly of minors, the trafficker, oftentimes what we would call a pimp, will take the birth certificate so that the victim doesn't have the ability to go get legal documents. Isolation, working in remote work sites, confined to an area where they don't have access to services, and they may not necessarily have the ability to contact law enforcement if need be. In the sex trafficking cases, oftentimes a pimp is actively utilizing tactics that make that person feel isolated. Maybe the minor or the individual being forced into prostitution is working in an area where there's not a lot of services available. It's a blighted area. So isolation is something that's present across all types of trafficking cases. And then physical and sexual abuse.
Hi, my name is Nora Kramer, and I am a staff nurse at Thomas Jefferson University Hospital. And I am going to be presenting Part 2, the protocol steps for frontline healthcare personnel. The first thing we just want to always look at is confidentiality. And everyone that is listening today that works in a healthcare setting, your institution probably has some type of policy or some type of guidelines for confidentiality. It is important that we always adhere to that, because privacy and confidentiality can help establish a respect and a trust, and those respect and trust are so vital in working with this type of population. First thing we want to do is, if anyone feels that they are in imminent danger, anyone, whether it would be the patient, most importantly, the trafficking victim, or the healthcare personnel, we need to call 911. No one wants to ever put themselves, or no one is expected to put themselves in a dangerous situation. And at any point, if a suspected child, elder, or disabled abuse, we would always follow our mandated reporting policy. At Jefferson, and I'm sure at other institutions, there are mandated reporting policies, and there are screening tools that are available for all staff. These are important that you become acquainted with your screening policies for child abuse, elder abuse in your institution, and follow the mandated reporting policy. This slide here gives you an overview of the protocol steps that are to follow. And at this time, I just wanted to thank the Philadelphia Anti-Trafficking Coalition for working with Jefferson to help develop these protocol steps. In the healthcare field, we respond when we are able to do a thorough assessment and a thorough evaluation. And many times patients come in with several things going on. And these steps have helped us fine-tune our ability to become more in tune to figuring out if someone could possibly be a victim of human trafficking. And it is so important as we go through these steps, and all of these steps, this is a busy slide, it lists all the steps, but we will be going through all of the steps step by step. But again, as you can see on the side, it does say if the patient is in immediate danger and under the age of 18, we would call 911. Step 1, suspicion of trafficking red flags. When a patient comes in, obviously you want to attend to the patient's health care needs. But as presented earlier with the frontline staff, there are times when somebody feels that something just isn't right. You get that sense, and as healthcare workers, we get senses that something isn't right. You want to notify the HT point person and the healthcare provider who will do the healthcare evaluation. Step 1, general red flags. And these are the red flags, and there are more red flags, but this is a list that we put together. This tells you here, inconsistent stories, scripted stories, malnutrition, delayed medical care, evidence of sexual or physical abuse, fear of law enforcement, not in possession of identification documents, works excessively long hours, sleeps and works in the same place, and the accompanying party insists on answering questions for the patient and refuses to leave. Red flags of labor trafficking would be injuries or illness due to the lack of proper protective gear or excessively long hours worked with limited access to food or drink, job-related inquiries that have been treated. And as we were reviewing these red flags, a lot of these can be picked up by the frontline healthcare personnel. It may not be picked up immediately by the person delivering the care, but someone would be picking these up. Red flags of sex trafficking, multiple frequent STIs, frequent or forced abortion, large number of sexual partners, substance abuse, frequent relocation, and branding tattoos. The red flags of minor trafficking would be a young age. Sometimes the age can be as young as 12. Homelessness, runaways, a dysfunctional family, a history of abuse, a foster care, LGBTQ, stated age older than visible appearance, and the use of terms like daddy, the life, and the game. And again, minors providing commercial sex do not need to prove fraud, or coercion. If the minor, we can call 911 immediately. We should call 911. We need to call 911. Now, step 2 comes to the health exam. We are going to look at what brought the patient here to begin with. So the healthcare provider wants to separate the patient from the accompanying person. And this may be the time where finally the patient, the victim, may be able to get some type of assistance, when you can separate them from the accompanied person. And this is a time when we can use our confidentiality, our privacy policies, our HIPAA law, to provide a reason that there should be the patient separated from the accompanying person. Then we want to conduct a thorough health exam and documentation. And then, if we feel that there were red flags, we pass the patient along to the point person for the human trafficking assessment. Step 3 is the human trafficking assessment. The point person then would conduct specific human trafficking assessments, and the point person would make decisions for further action. If the patient is screened negative, we would proceed with the routine medical care. If the patient is screened positive and suspicion of trafficking is confirmed, then we proceed to step 4, the point person's response. Step 3. In step 3, some of the questions that that the point person would be asking: is anyone forcing you to do anything that you do not want to do? Are you allowed to freely leave your house, your work? Has anyone threatened to hurt you, your family, or threatened to report you to the police? Has anyone taken your identification documents, your passport, your driver's license? Can you get it back if you want it? Is anyone restricting you from seeing your family and friends or tracking your movement? And this is why it is so valuable to have a point person, because the point person will have time to establish some type of rapport and provide the privacy and confidentiality for the patient to open up with such delicate issues. The point person response. The point person will then evaluate the patient based upon the age. If the patient is under 18 years of age, we immediately would follow mandated reporting. If the patient is 18 years of age or over, we would review with the patient the available assistance options, and then we would proceed to step 5, which would be the patient's response. The patient's response. Again, with respecting the patient, respecting privacy, in order to establish any type of rapport with patients we work with, we have to establish a respect. So if a patient declines, we need to respect that. We want to make sure we offer resources on how to get help. We want to offer to work out a safety plan, and we want to offer to make up a follow-up appointment. The number for the National Human Trafficking Resource Center is easy to remember. 1-888-3737-888. Again, if we're all sitting here thinking now, we can actually remember 38-3737-888. So it is important that we try to at least have the patient understand that number. The coalition actually designed a Band-Aid holder, and if we can discreetly give the patient the Band-Aid holder with the number for the National Human Trafficking Resource Center, if we feel that it would not put the patient in jeopardy, we can hand that to the patient just so that they have that resource available. If the patient accepts, with the patient, we call the human trafficking hotline. And then, once connected to the hotline, this hotline specialist, we would give the patient privacy to talk to the hotline specialist. And as you can see on this slide, this kind of sums it all up, how important it is in a healthcare institution to have teamwork, to get the job done. And here you have frontline staff that will be working with multiple different patients. And it would be the frontline staff who had just had a sixth sense and noticed something. And as Camille had presented earlier, the frontline staff can be anyone from the radiologist, the X-ray tech, to the unit clerk, to the nursing assistant, to the person that's taking the blood pressure, to the critical care tech, to the nurse, that identifies a red flag. And as you can see, when red flags are identified, we immediately pull in the point person, who will then make sure that they proceed with the proper steps to be able to support the patient and give the patient the opportunity to get the assistance they need. And again, this slide, as we showed earlier, shows you all of the steps. It shows you the step 1, step 2, the health exam, the human trafficking assessment, the point person response, and then the patient's response.
What to avoid doing. Do not try to rescue the patient or use accompanying person for the interpretation, because that person who is accompanying them may actually be the individual who's trafficking them. Do not contact law enforcement without that patient's consent. And do not ask about immigration status. That patient has been traumatized while they're going through this ordeal. And they've been told, based on the information that we had already received from the power and coercion wheel from Chris, that they've been told not to get in contact with certain people, to not trust. And in order for us to do the point person to do the work that they need to do in order to assist this potentially trafficked person, that trust must be established. And we're going to talk about that as well as different communication barriers that can make that process very difficult. Now, I want just to be mindful that if you have any questions, to please write them down, and we will be able to, in the chat box, please write them in the chat box so that we can address them at the end of this webinar. We have a specific area to address any questions that you may have, and we will do that. This is very dense and heavy information, and I'm pretty sure that there will be some questions that are there. So just write them down so that gives us an opportunity to address any questions that you may have towards the end. Now, communication barriers. There are specific items that can distort communication. As we see, and we'll go into what these items are, but as we see, one bear is trying to communicate with the other, and if these barriers are there, then it's going to cause friction, it's going to cause a problem. Now, some of the barriers to screening, we're going to focus on staff now. Time, forgetting, our own stereotypes, not wanting to know the answer, unsure of what to do next. The patient's partner, friend, and or children over the age of 2 are in the room, or it's not on a person's job description. Some of these barriers that we are looking at now can also trigger a secondary trauma, which is something that I'm going to discuss with you a little bit later. You may not have the amount of time, as Nora was stating before, with the point person. The point person actually has a little bit more time to spend with the potential trafficked person. Sometimes a person may forget to get different pieces of information. With that point person, because they have that more time to spend, there's more likely that less things will be forgotten. Be aware of what your own stereotypes are. You may even be showcasing some of your stereotypes through your body language and not even aware that you're doing it. Sometimes you don't want to know what the answer is, because again, it may trigger some things, some traumas or some experiences that you've had that you put behind you. And you don't want those things to come back up again. Unsure what to do next. This can make a lot of people very anxious and make them freeze. Even if they want to help because they don't know what to do next, sometimes a person decides not to do anything. The partners, the patient's partner, friend, and or children over the age of 2 are in the room. Again, we don't know if that person who's accompanying that patient is the individual who's trafficking them. The children or persons over the age of 2 may communicate to the individual who is trafficking this patient and tell them what happened. So, and other issues is that sometimes a person doesn't want to do anything extra outside of what is on their job description. So you just be very aware and be very mindful of some of the barriers that staff has. Now, again, recognizing your own triggers. Remember I was talking about the secondary trauma. If there is a trauma history and you're speaking with a patient and that patient's story is triggering some of your past traumas, that is your secondary traumatization. You're being traumatized again just through hearing somebody else's story. So it's very, very important that you need to be aware of what your own reactions are, normalizing, taking a time out after you've worked with that person. If you need to take a couple minutes for some time to yourself just to kind of decompress, to relax, to release some of that stress, do that. Have someone that you can talk to, a peer support. I know a lot of us in the healthcare field have someone else at our offices that we talk to as a support person. Professional support. Make sure that if that's something that you need, that you also have access to that as well. And it's extremely important also to follow the recommended human trafficking protocol steps, which is what Nora had explained in the previous slides. Now, some of the barriers for patients are fear, shame, their comfort level, distrust of authority figures, feeling like no one cares. And the patients may not even recognize that they are victims. Chris touched upon this when we were talking about the power wheel, and when he also stated that someone may be with the au pairs, that someone may be being trafficked, but because they are taking care of the children, they may not even recognize what's happening to them, and they have created this bond with the kids, with those children that they're taking care of. And once that bond is created, sometimes it's very difficult for the person who is being trafficked to even recognize that that is what's happening to them. A lot of times they're isolated. When that isolation comes, then you're going to feel like no one cares. And there's going to be shame and fear. The physical abuse and the sexual abuse can also produce that affects a person's comfort level. And then there's also that distrust of authority figures. Oftentimes they're told not to talk to speak to anyone of authority. So again, it's extremely important to build trust. The very fact that they're there and they are putting themselves in your care to get the help that they need, there's some level of trust that's there. You have to continue building on it. You can show empathy and non-judgmental attitudes. That continues to build on that trust. Validate that patient's feelings. Validate what it is that they feel, because oftentimes no one validates them. Convey messages of hope and prioritize safety of patient, self, and staff. Because remember, they are living in situations that their safety is compromised on a daily basis. So, be transparent, be responsive, be caring, be sincere, and trustworthy. Now, we have resources in Pennsylvania. You can see some of the names of the organizations and also how to get in contact with them. Covenant House, Dawn's Place, Friends of Farm Workers, Lutheran Settlement House, Nationalities, Network of Victim Assistance, Salvation Army, Truth for Women, Villanova, The Well, and the YWCA. The Anti-Trafficking Coalition is throughout all counties in Pennsylvania. Other resources, national. There are other resources that are also national, and you can see the names of these resources as well. Heal Trafficking, the National Human Trafficking Resource Center, the Hotline, the National Trafficking Resource Center, the National Survivors Network, Office on Trafficking in Persons, Physicians Against the Trafficking of Humans, and Polaris. Please look at all of these different resources. Continue to educate yourselves. So, now we are in the questions component, and we have some questions to answer. So will we be able to receive these slides? Yes, you will. How many HT point persons do you typically have available at a time? Well, that depends on the size of your site. You may need one. You may need a few to work as a team. Again, it depends on the size of your site.
And I can speak to, this is Nora talking from Jefferson Hospital. I can speak that we actually, point persons do not just have to be the nurse. They can be the social worker, the caseworker, security officer. They're people that really have taken a vested interest and want to continue further training to have an understanding and develop a comfort level with an uncomfortable situation. So I can tell you, and the amount of point persons would vary in any institution, but when you have a place that's open 24/7, you do want to make sure that you have all different types of frontline personnel that may be interested in becoming point persons to avail that opportunity to them.
Are you aware of how many hospital systems or clinics have an HT point person? No. We are exploring this now. We are developing the pilot programs and protocols so that we can get this into various different hospitals and clinics. Do you inform the minor or the adult in immediate danger that you contacted law enforcement?
This is Chris from Nationalities Service Center. When working with a victim, it's extremely important to communicate with them any type of information you want to share beyond your conversations with the victim. So that would include not only accessing services, but certainly anytime you reach out to law enforcement. A lot of cases where there's not an immediate danger present, it may be appropriate just to refer to services and leave contacting law enforcement for a later time, after you've had the opportunity to gather more information and kind of plan how that reporting is going to go with the victim so that they're ready to deal with those requirements. Anyone in immediate danger, you would still want to secure the victim's consent to contact, 911. But you can chime in and you can chime in at this time when you're speaking with the victim and give them your honest assessment that you believe they're in some type of serious danger and that it would be in their best interest to reach out to law enforcement. And then it's very much in the victim's, hands what they want to do after that. In terms of a minor child, if there's a guardian there, then you would want to work with that guardian. Yeah, and obviously make sure that the guardian is not sort of complicit in the trafficking in that situation.
Are there any laws in place where we can report a suspected trafficker? Chris?
Well, trafficking is a crime, and it can be reported to either local, state, or federal law enforcement. Sort of echoing what I said for the previous question, in cases that there's not an immediate danger present, I always caution people to report to service providers first who have experience kind of screening for trafficking more thoroughly and also assessing the immediate needs of the victim. And then oftentimes they're familiar with the most appropriate law enforcement agency to report to. So, trafficking is a crime, and it can be reported to law enforcement. Obviously, for children, there are mandatory reporting laws in the case of sexual abuse and other kinds of harm to children. But for adults, service providers are not covered by those laws. This is really oftentimes at the discretion of the person who's working with the victim, whether that's the point person or anyone else, really assessing the immediate danger and either making that referral to a service provider, or if it's more immediate than that, the danger, talking to the victim about reporting to law enforcement.
Many potential victims don't even know what the term trafficking really is or means, and doesn't identify with this. What is a better way or term to use than trafficked or trafficking? It's a very good question.
I know when I work with victims in a legal context, often when I explain trafficking, I talk about it in terms of exploitation and how the control that they've described that either an employer or a trafficker has put them under, is something impermissible. And oftentimes at that point, the victim kind of, I see that they recognize that the situation as they described it, that I'm very much just confirming their feelings about that situation. Like, they may not be familiar with the concept or the term trafficking or the definition of it, but through a conversation, oftentimes you can kind of reach a point of like mutual assent with the victim where there is that kind of group comprehension that the person was in a situation that was bad and that you're there to help. And that's kind of oftentimes the best way to kind of start getting the victim out of the situation they're in.
You mentioned not to contact law enforcement without permission. Regarding under the age of 18, we should contact 911. Please elaborate.
Yeah, so there many people in the social services field are covered by mandatory reporting laws that require anytime a child is suspected of being abused by anyone within their family or outside of it to report that to the police. So that's what I was referencing in terms of reporting for children under the age of 18.
And that's what the protocol is saying, that if a patient is under the age of 18 and they are being trafficked, we do have mandated reporting to call 911 because of their age. So that is just that's the law, that we have to call 911.
What if the identified human trafficking point person isn't available? Is there a backup plan?
I think that in any healthcare institution that's opened 24/7 and these victims can come in at any hour, I can tell you that's an excellent question, and it's like, is there a backup plan for any time that we run out of resources? I think the one thing I would tell you is by doing this training at Jefferson, all of the workers have now more of awareness and an understanding. And I think if there was not a HT person at the time available, they are more comfortable with the resources that are available, and they will just have to step in and try to help resolve the situation. Most of the time, and I think that, that it's a great question. We're probably not going to always have a point person in any institution, but the fact that your staff where you work, if the question is from a healthcare institution, you have developed a lot more awareness of what trafficking is. Because when we started this training, many staff they did not know what trafficking was. They did not know what the red flags were. They did not know what resources were available. And by doing training for your staff, then everyone at least would be aware of some of the resources and try to get some type of potential help for the patient. And maybe the backup plan would be try to get the patient to come back again, give a reason for the patient to come back so that the point person could be there to give further guidance. Like, try to assess the situation. We know that this person needs help. We may not be able to give all the help right now. We're not sure what's going on. Try to arrange that the patient would have to come back.
Can you give some specific examples of the elements of an HT screening, human trafficking screening, and what do you do if you don't have an HT person at your institution?
Well, I think that some of the specific examples would be, if a patient comes in with a medical problem, but your security personnel, your unit clerk, someone noticed that the person that was accompanying them was being being forceful, was not letting them speak for themselves. If the patient comes in and does not have their own identification and has to get the identification from the person that's accompanying them, if the patient states that they don't have their ID and they're not allowed to have their ID, these are things that have immediately come up as red flags, that there is something the matter. So specific examples would be, patients that do not carry their own identification, patients that have an accompanying person who seems incredibly forceful, and this may not have been picked up by the nurse that would be in the emergency department doing the assessment. This would have been picked up by the frontline person. So I would tell you that kind of screening has taken place at our institution, and then it has been passed on, and then the assessment would be done, and then an evaluation would be done if we do need to make referrals to the human trafficking hotline.
And if you don't have an HT person at your institution, then let's develop one. This webinar is to give you information on getting an HT person at your institution. Get in contact with us. We will help you get one there.
Yeah, and I would just chime in that I think step 3 of the protocol is really where you see the elements of the trafficking screening in the protocol. That's where the point person is working with someone who is suspected of being a potential victim and asking those questions that kind of suss out maybe additional red flags that may help you confirm your suspicion that this person may be a trafficking victim, or hopefully maybe clarify some of the things that you observed to draw the conclusion that this is not an exploitative situation. So, and you can see some of those questions to ask under the slides for step 3. And I would encourage anyone instituting this protocol to utilize screening tools that we're in the process of developing that would have sort of a more in-depth series of questions that would help uncover both labor and sex trafficking.
If the trafficker is suspicious about things and takes the potential victim and leaves, what could be or should be done? Well, it seems like a forced situation. And if the trafficker decides to leave the hospital, I mean, we can do everything in our potential and our possibility to get the person to stay, so that they can be seen, so that they can get the services that they need to have. And then once we are able to do that, we can actually have some of the frontline people separate the trafficker from the potential victim in order to continue with the health assessment. So things can be done to prevent that. But again, it's extremely important to be aware of what these red flags are, to work together as a team so that this can be done.
And it is difficult and challenging work because you do not ever want to put the patient, the victim, in danger. Mm-hmm. So you want to fine-tune your skills so that we try not to make the trafficker suspicious. And that's why we would want to use confidentiality and privacy and remove the patient from the trafficker at the first opportunity possible. If they come into a healthcare setting, we do have guidelines for privacy and confidentiality that does empower us to separate them. Now, after the separation, if the victim or the patient goes back to their trafficker and they're not comfortable with getting help at the time, well, I mean, we've done our best. We've made sure that they're aware of what the resources are that are out there. And it's a challenging question, it's a challenging subject, it's an uncomfortable subject, and I don't think anybody has all the right answers.
What type of education does the point person have outside of this training?
I think that would depend on what role. I think the first type of education would be a desire and an interest in this topic. I think this is an uncomfortable topic. It's a challenging topic, and I think people that really feel called to make a difference would be people that would be wanting to become the point persons. I think when we did the training, people that were not aware of trafficking and became aware of it spoke out that they would definitely be interested in becoming a point person. And then they do a lot of, there are a lot of resources out there. There's a lot of good organizations, and it has to be a lot of independent, learning. And I will tell you, your best point people are those that take it and go and do all their type of independent learning on the side. And again, it's challenging because it's uncomfortable, and it's not something, it's seen, but it's not recognized. And part of the goal is to get people to recognize it.
And there are a lot of training opportunities in Pennsylvania. Here in Philadelphia, we have our own trafficking coalition. That's kind of a clearinghouse for all of the training opportunities in the city. And I know a lot of the counties outside of the city also have their own trafficking coalitions that also provide training. So with a little bit of internet research, there's always trafficking training available to prospective point people who are interested in fulfilling this role.
Yes, and you can also get in contact with the Nationalities Service Center. You can get in contact with the Philadelphia Anti-Trafficking Anti-Trafficking Coalition. There's a lot of information that's on the internet. Some of the resources that we provided towards the in this webinar, you can also get in contact with them. Polaris. I mean, there is a wealth and depth of information so that you can continue to educate yourself on a very sensitive topic. Nora was correct. This is a very heavy topic, and it can be very uncomfortable for some people. But the very fact that you're asking about where can I go get more information, and you're asking these types of questions, tell me more about the HT person, tell me more about the frontline person, shows that there is a spark that has been lit in order to assist and to help in this type of work. There's so many people out there that are suffering in silence. And the very fact that you're asking these types of questions, maybe you can become the next HT person at your facility.
And I can speak for Jefferson that when we've had questions, and we've had many, the Nationalities Service Center has been always very open and receptive to take all of our questions and to guide us, because this is, it's hidden in plain sight. And with the awareness that we have developed, sometimes we have found out that it was hidden in plain sight. And I could tell you that one of the things that many of the ED nurses stated as we did the training was the misses that they've had in their past. And a goal that they have established was to never miss another potential victim of trafficking. So it's a challenging subject, it's a difficult subject, but there are resources there, and we have become more aware of what trafficking is and what resources are available for us, because we don't have the expertise and all the answers.
I am understanding of the red flags, but I am further curious about what happens in the actual screening and or evaluation. Or is screening what you mean by red flags?
If a patient comes in most of the patients would be presenting to our healthcare institution with some type of medical reason. And the medical reason that they come in for, we obviously would be treating them for that. But in the process of doing the healthcare assessment, some of the red flags, and the red flags could be, the person who's accompanying them, the fact that they don't have identification, and any of the red flags that we discussed earlier. If a patient has a medical condition that is a condition that's not easily explained, or it looks like they've been had no access to health care, these red flags immediately tell you that there's more to this picture. And it's just like in anything we do in healthcare, red flags just tell us sometimes that there's more to this picture than what we see. So then we're doing that thorough evaluation and screening, and that's when we need to be able to establish a rapport with the patient so we can ask some of these questions to see what other further assistance that we can be of. And all of the red flags stated doesn't always mean that someone is a victim of human trafficking. It's just that the red flags are present, and it gives us an idea that we may need to do further screening to figure out what is going on in this case.
Would the point person have a screening tool with set questions to ask? Yes, we do. Some of the questions that were asked at the step 3 process, such as, Is anyone forcing you to do anything that you do not want to do? Are you allowed to freely leave your house work? These are some of the questions that are asked with the screening tool. Has anyone threatened to hurt you, your family, or threatened to report you to the police? These are some of the questions that are used in order to do the assessment, to find out if this person is being trafficked. Has anyone taken your identification documents? Would you get it back if you want it? It's the same thing that Nora had just discussed previously. Is anyone restricting you from seeing your family and friends or tracking your movement? These questions, which are all part of the assessment, allows the HT point person to find out more about the patient that is sitting in front of them, and to see if they are being trafficked.
And at Jefferson, what we designed is we have a small card that has the questions to ask, because sometimes, in an uncomfortable situation, questions could leave somebody's mind, and so we do have the questions printed up so that people could refer to the questions if they felt that they, if they needed that screening tool.
How do I access the protocol to use to increase awareness in the ED where I am working as a nurse? We can send you all of the information that you are requesting. Please feel free to get in contact with us. And we will be able to come do additional trainings and assist you in developing and implementing this protocol, providing information so that your frontline staff are aware of the red flags, can see them, so that no one else slips through the cracks. And to also develop an HT point person at your facility. So yes, please get in contact with us so that we can provide you with this information.
The team at the Philadelphia Anti-Trafficking Coalition is a phenomenal team that is willing to train anywhere. So if you really, at your ED, you want to have increased awareness, they will come to your ED and train your staff. It would be a question of getting your staff together for a training. So I would just tell you to contact the contact information here on the slides, especially at the Nationalities Service Center. Contact them and a training can be arranged at your ED.
Right, well, thank you. Thank you for all of your questions. Thank you for all of your questions. Thank you for the time. Thank you for your interest in this topic.